Alright, we're continuing on with our exploration of what functions are by looking at some real-world examples. This is not going to have any math to it, it's just going to be a way to kind of visualize this input-output relationship with things that you encounter on a daily basis in life. So the first one to talk about is distance and time, right? So say you're taking a trip, you're driving somewhere, the distance that you travel would be the output, and the amount of time that's passed would be the input. And this is a function because for any certain amount of time that's passed, for any given input, you've definitely traveled an exact certain distance, and only one possible distance. So an hour into your trip, there is only one possible value for the distance that you've traveled, it's how far you've gone. So this input-output relationship, having one output for each input, makes it an example of a function. Another example is the height of a ball as a function of time when you throw it up. So if you throw a ball up, it goes up and then it comes back down. So at any certain amount of time that's passed for an input value, there is exactly and only one height of the ball. So after 0 seconds, it's wherever it started, and then as time goes on, it goes up, and then it comes back down. The reason I like this example is because even though for each input there's only one output, it's certainly possible that there's two different inputs that have the same height, right? So for example, right here and right here. Maybe this is like 2 seconds, and then it goes up, and now this is 4 seconds, and then it starts coming back down, and this is 6 seconds, and then this is 8 seconds, right? So just hypothetically. After 2 seconds, it's exactly this high. That means it's a function. After 6 seconds, it's exactly this high. So for each time, there's only one possible output. That makes it a function. But if you look at it backwards, if you look at the time at which it's a certain height, if you pick this height, there's two different times when it's at that height. That's okay, it's still a function. It's just something kind of cool or curious that if you only know the output, there might be more than one input that leads to it. But if you know the input, then it's definitely a one-way path towards the output. Okay, another example is the amount of money you earn based on how many hours you work. So if you have an hourly job, the more hours you work, the more money you get. If you work a certain number of hours, that's your input. There is an exact set amount of money that you've earned, which is your output. Lastly is the temperature of hot chocolate over time. So if you have a cup of hot chocolate and you set it out, it starts off, say, pretty warm, and then over time it's going to cool. But after a certain amount of time has passed, 20 minutes later, the temperature of the hot chocolate can only have exactly one value. It can't simultaneously be two different temperatures. Okay, so a couple of things to notice. The first thing to notice is when you're talking about these input-output relationships, you write always output, then input. So distance as a function of time, height as a function of time, money as a function of hours, temperature as a function of time. So it's always output as a function of input because the output depends on what the input was. The second thing to notice is that all these examples, they use the input variable as time. Okay, that's really, really common in real-world situations. Of course, there are other possibilities, but in many, many situations, in science classes, and even in your book in math class, or just when you're talking about or thinking of real-world examples of functions, it's very common for them to be something as a function of time, something versus time. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And maybe for yourselves, try to think up a couple of real-world examples of functions where the output depends on the input, and every input has exactly one output, and then in class we can share them.